Hello everyone. Let's continue our discussion on complex numbers. Today what we're going to talk about is adding, subtracting, and multiplying complex numbers. One thing that bothers me with teachers is that some can look at you and say, "This is so easy. I don't understand how you don't know this," or be able to look at you and say, "Oh, what we're going to cover today is easy. Y'all be able to get it no problem." And I hate ever saying that. But what I will tell you about complex numbers, it's something to, let's say, to delight in, is that what we're going to talk about today should make sense and should be easy for most of y'all. So, even though the word complex numbers means it's something complex, what we're getting ready to do is not. So, for instance, whenever I add, it's like I'm combining like terms. I'm going to combine my real numbers with real numbers and my imaginary with imaginary. So if you just can see the math and you say, oh, well, that's 4 plus 2, and that's 6, and that's 3i plus 2i, well, that's 5i, then that is how simple it is. If you don't see that, or let's say you're more cautious, then you can write this as more traditional arithmetic problem. 3i plus 2i is 5i, and 4 plus 2 is 6. 5i is positive, so that is 6 plus 5i. That is adding. So, notice in my first term that I've had here, this time I threw in some negative numbers, okay? But we're still adding. The addition sign separates the two complex numbers. Pause the video, work it, let's see if we get the same answers. Alright, so whenever I look at this, just how I see it, I say that's a negative 4 plus 4, so that is 0. And then I have a negative 2i plus 6i, so that's 4i. So what's my final answer? 4i. Again, if you don't like to do that, then you can do it like this. Again, we're adding those together. So a negative 2i plus 6i, well, that's 4i. And that is a positive 4i, so I'll put a plus sign there. And a negative 4 plus 4, that's 0. Same thing. Again, whenever you do math, just because I show you guys a certain way to work the problem doesn't mean that that's the way that your brain works. What I try to do is whenever I instruct you and I tell you how to work something, I try to show you fundamentally so that way you get a series of steps, some reasoning to say, okay, I went from here to here. To be truthful with y'all, most of the ways that I show you, I don't really use. So again, how you work the problem, all that I ask of you is to be structured and to critically think about what you're doing. Alright, next one we're going to look at is subtraction. The key thing with subtraction is to make sure that you distribute the negative sign. Notice in my problems I have a negative sign separating my two complex numbers. That's why we call it subtraction. So with this one, I will have 2 plus 4i, and I'm going to distribute my negative sign. So how I can view this is I could just say plus and then a negative 3 minus 2i. Now I'm back to an addition problem. So I look at it and I say, well, that will be a negative 1, 2 plus a negative 3, and 4i plus a negative 2i is 2i, where I can work it out. Using the arithmetic form is up here. For time's sake, we're moving on. So in this one, I have a negative 1 plus 5i. I distribute my negative sign. So how I'm going to work it is like this. Whoops. Let me get rid of these. This is how I actually work the problem. This is how my mind works. I break down those parentheses, and I'm just going to distribute and keep the signs in front of everyone. A negative, distributing it through, so that becomes a positive, so that's plus 4, and that becomes a negative. Whenever you're distributing a negative sign, just in case you guys don't know, you can view this as a negative 1. and it's like you're multiplying it. You're saying a negative 1 times this and a negative 1 times that. That's how the signs flip. Here's another way in which you can do it if you want. You can rearrange. You can put all your like terms next to each other. Remember, the sign that is in front of the term stays with that term. So I pulled the plus sign with the 4 and the negative sign with the 2i. And it becomes 3 plus 3i. Well, what I hope is that my initial statement to you guys is that you would find this to be simplistic. It's very much like when we were just dealing with expressions and equations and combining like terms. Okay, so what we will do is now look at multiplication. Okay, now most of y'all from intermediate algebra should have already talked about how to FOIL. FOIL is nothing more than distributing terms of the first complex number into the second. That's all that FOIL is. We'll start off with working some simple problems though, in looking at whenever I have a negative sign inside of a radical. Okay, talk about multiplication this way, and then we'll get to our complex numbers. So here's the first example, and I have it worked out for you, is that I have the square root of a negative 3 times the square root of a negative 5. Remember from our previous lesson, I told you to break that down into two radicals. So I have the square root of a negative 1 times the square root of 3 times the square root of a negative 1 times the square root of 5. I times I is I squared. The square root of 3 times the square root of 5 is 15. The value of I squared equals a negative 1. So a negative 1 times the radical 15 equals a negative radical 15. Go ahead and pause the video and see what you get for this answer. See if we get the same answer. Alright, so let's work it. The square root of a negative 1 is I. The square root of 12, well, that can be broken down to the radical 3, radical 4. Square root of a negative 1, I, and that's 5. So I squared, 2 radical 3, square root of 4 is 2, and then radical 3 times 5. I is equivalent on a negative 1. 5 times 2 is 10. So a negative 10 radical 3. Okay, pause the video and see if you can FOIL these or distribute each term. Let me indicate that, because that's all that FOIL is. You're going to take 3 and you're going to distribute it to those terms, and then you're going to take 4i and you're going to distribute it. Remember, the sign in front of the term stays with the term. Alright, so what I end up here with is 3 times 2 is 6, and 3 times 2i is 6i, and then 4i times 2 is 8i, and then 4i times 2i is 8i squared. 8i squared. I squared is what? What does I squared equal? Negative 1. Very good. So I end up with 6 plus 14i plus 8 times a negative 1. That becomes a negative 8. Right? That becomes a negative 8. I end up with my final answer, a negative 2 plus 14i. Next one, negative 6 times 2 is a negative 12. A negative 6 times a negative 3i is plus 18i. Negative times a negative is a positive. A negative I times 2 is a negative 2i. A negative I times a negative 3i is a positive 3i squared. I have a negative 12 plus 16i minus 3, because again, what does I squared equal? A negative 1. So that turns into 3 times a negative 1, negative 3. Negative 15 plus 16i. And ladies and gentlemen, that is addition, subtraction, and multiplication. Again, please watch the publisher's videos, structure your homework, work it the same way each time. Work the problems until you say, yes, I know how to work that type of problem. And good luck with your remaining homework.